All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Josef Šíma. I'm professor of economics and president of this beautiful place, which is CEVRO Institut, private college established some 6 years ago, a school where you can study both private and public law, political science, and international relations. Also economics, political philosophy, and some other fields. And you can receive here BA and MA degree. The school is becoming a place where not only educational activities happen, but where we organize events, social and cultural, so that students actually like the school and they come often and enjoy hospitality of this place, which is tied very firmly to the history of Czech nation. Today we are here to spend an hour or an hour and a half as a part of what is called CEVRO Institut Forum, which is a public lecture series hosting leading figures from academic sphere, business, or politics, and debating both current policy issues and deep theoretical concepts. We had very great speakers in the past, such as Professor Richard Epstein, a leading legal scholar from University of Chicago and New York University. We had Professor Peter Boettke from George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. We had Mr. Milfight, Vice President of Microsoft Corporation. We had Chairman of Slovak Parliament, Mr. Sulik, and many other guests. A few months ago, I've read a leading Czech business journal to which I contributed a book review and spotted a page-long article with a very attractive title. It was called A Country of Innovational Miracles. I have read it and learned about an impressive list of high-tech products, including Amazon's Kindle or Microsoft's Kinect, whose origin can be traced to research units and firms located in the state of Israel. The article was written by our today's guest, His Excellency Yaakov Levy, Israeli ambassador to Prague. Indeed, the state of Israel gets on the first pages of the world media, not only due to economic successes that impresses me, an economist. There are many more things to talk about, and I'm sure we cannot wish for a better and more informed guest to share with us his view on the current position or situation of Israel, which is a topic of our today's CEVRO Institut Forum. Then His Excellency Yaakov Levy. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Professor. Shalom to all of you. You might notice soon this isn't a typical lecture where I'm going to stand up there, read something for 40 minutes, which I prepared, bore you to sleep, and then you'll go over and revive yourself with some coffee. So I hope we'll have a discussion, and if I don't get questions straight away, I will ask you questions. You probably think I'm joking, but that isn't the case. So let's start with, I'll tell you a word about my professional, personal background, and through that, what an ambassador does, and through that, we'll hold a discussion. And you can ask me any question you want on politics, economics, Israel, diplomacy, anything you have in mind. I promise to try to answer. See if you catch me with something I really won't be able to answer. I'd be happy to do so. Let's start with the first question, maybe, before I launch into some background or talk. And don't be embarrassed. You have an opportunity to ask anything you'd like. Yeah, I know it's a little difficult to break the ice. So I'll just start by telling you a little background and then maybe ask you some questions. How did I go into foreign service? I studied economics and business administration. I was talking about it with the professor upstairs. And I thought I'd go into business, economics, work in a bank, or maybe in the Ministry of Finance. But then I got involved in student politics. The student world was really up in arms in the late 60s, early 70s, because of what happened in this region. The invasion of Czechoslovakia, the student revolts in Paris, the movement against the Vietnam War, against apartheid in South Africa, against the colonels taking over in Greece. And I traveled around to student conferences, and it became very interesting. Much more, sorry to say, the professor isn't listening, much more than what I considered to be my future in economics. So I decided to take the test in the Foreign Service and joined the diplomatic service. I've served in various positions in the United States twice, in New York and Boston, then in Italy, where I had to study Italian and get to know the work culture in a different place, then at the United Nations as ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva, where I had to study French, and in many positions back home, of course, because we go back home between assignments, and now in Czech Republic, where I had to study Czech, but bohužel, that was too difficult for me. I don't have the background, the linguistic background, the declination, so I'm afraid that's the first assignment where I don't speak the language. So I'd like to pose a question to you, maybe, to start with, to get you involved. When I came to Italy, I didn't know one Italian. When I came to Prague, I didn't know one Czech person. Hard to believe? So what would you do if I can have some advice here? A new ambassador comes in to Prague, doesn't know anyone. How does he start his work? What should he do? If I don't get volunteers, I usually nominate a panel of advisors to give me advice, to work out kind of diplomatic work. And through that we'll get, by the way, to politics and economics rather than giving a direct lecture and then taking a few questions. So worry not. We'll cover all the subjects and anything you'd like to talk about. If I don't get ideas, I nominate a panel of advisors. So maybe I'll get some ideas. I got some ideas when I would go to universities and high schools to speak. And usually the first advice I would get as to what to do as a new diplomat would start with the letter P. What would it be? Pub, exactly. But not only pub. There were 3 Ps. What would the next P be? Pardon? Party. Right? An ambassador should party. And the third P would be specific. Pilsner. Drink some beer. Yes. So that would be the usual advice. But on a more serious note, what would you think an ambassador, a new diplomat would do? Advice from above. When he doesn't know anyone in the country. Yes. Excellent. So my first advice on my staff is you. How about 2 other volunteers? Can I ask you to join my advisors? Yes. And maybe someone in the back here. 3 advisors. My first work day, what do I do? Yes? Yes? Very good. So how would I do it? Let's say I would want to meet some people. Who would I meet to ask about what's happening here? Yes, these are very busy people. I would put in a request to meet the Prime Minister. He'd say, why? I want to learn about Czech Republic. He'd say, come in 3 months because I'm busy. what would I do till then? Who would I meet to get advice? By the way, I did it. I got such advice, but who would you suggest? How about my other advisors? Or I could take other volunteers also. Who would I meet? Well, I need to fire my advisors and take a new staff? Oh no, that's too quick. That's a difficulty which any diplomat would face. I faced it in Italy. I faced it when I came to Boston as a consul general. A little less so at the UN in Geneva, because there it's more structured. You work with ambassadors and you work with international organizations. But I want to be effective. I want to have some impact. So who would I go to learn about the country? And who would I meet at the beginning, if you need to advise me? That's true, but technically it's not possible, because in international relations, two ambassadors cannot serve in the same capital even for 1 minute, because they represent the sovereign and there's only one sovereign. So he could maybe write to me something beforehand, but I couldn't get this kind of advice. I need to meet face to face to hear about it. So I don't have any background information about the country, but I need to start meeting people. So of course I need to meet the president, yes, because I need to present my credentials. But what else should an ambassador do? Come to speak at the university? Why? What would be the goal of it? Traditionally, ambassadors would meet and work with governments, with ministers, with deputy ministers. But in today's world, especially in democracies, we need to work with a spectrum of the public, of the country, with parliament, with the Senate, but also with the public. Today, the aspect of public diplomacy is very developed in our line of work, especially in the Israeli line of work, because of difficulties we have image-wise in some places. So the line of work of a diplomat today is quite different than it was in the past. So, for example, I speak at universities, I even speak at high schools, at the top classes. An ambassador would meet with the media, with editors, with reporters, with analysts. That's also how you get your information in order to understand what happens in a country. But think about it. You come into a foreign country where you don't know the people, you know the history basically, but not the nuances. Sometimes you can meet with a certain faction, certain people. You can make mistakes. So you really need equilibrated people and advisors to tell you who's the right person, who to stay away from, who to meet, who would give you solid advice, who might mislead you because of ignorance or because of other reasons. So it's not so simple, especially when you don't know anyone and you work in different work cultures each time. And my experience working in Israel, in the United States, in Italy, and now in Czech Republic and Central Europe, these are different working environments in many respects. Questions? Yes? True. That's true, but you probably know historically the Jewish community here is very small today because it was exterminated. Czechoslovakia had 375,000 Jewish residents in the borders of 1918, and 275,000 never returned from the extermination camps. And those who returned, most of them left because there was no one here. They wrote in their memoirs, the survivors, I came back to Prague, to Brno, no one was there, family, neighbors, so there was nothing to return to. So there are very few members of the Jewish community who can advise me, but it's true, there are many friends of Israel who can advise me, but it wasn't so before, because historically, Czechoslovakia broke relations with Israel in 1967 after the Arabs lost the Six-Day War, and they broke relations because the whole Soviet bloc broke relations because they supported the Arab countries in the war, and when their client states lost, so the immediate reaction was, we'll break relations with the one who won and embarrassed us. So for so many years, there were no diplomatic relations. There was no history to build on. And even in the years beforehand, we had diplomatic relations since 1949. In fact, Prague was our third minister, diplomatic representative, nominated by the new state of Israel, was to Prague. First was to Moscow, second was to Washington, and third was to Prague. Anyone knows why? Why didn't we nominate a diplomat when the state was founded to London, Paris, or other places? Why to Prague? Historically speaking, no idea. Because in 1948, when the State of Israel was established and there was a war with the existing Arab states, we needed assistance, we needed military training, and we needed some military equipment. And the only country that supplied us was Czechoslovakia. It was just in the period between the Democratic Republic and the communist takeover. And there was uncertainty here. We still had some friends in government, especially the foreign minister, Jan Masaryk. And at the time, weapons were sold and Israeli pilots trained here, which helped us survive. But when the communists came over, until 1967, Israeli representatives here could act in a very minimal way. They were followed constantly by the secret police. They really couldn't do anything publicly. And there were the famous trials in which also two Israelis, the Slansky Trials, saw two Israelis who happened to be here visiting, were arrested, tortured, tried, confessed, tried, sentenced for many years in prison, not to death because they were not Czechoslovak citizens. So we had a very difficult time until 1989, until the Velvet Revolution, when relations were restored and picked up. So there's little to build upon in history except the millennia of Jewish presence here, which enriched the Czechoslovak, the Czech people, and enriched us, but then was cut short by the Nazi invasion and occupation. So we've warmed up a little. Let's get some questions and fields in which you are interested, rather than my continuing. Or do I need to nominate other advisors? The first round, Spatny, didn't go so well. I didn't choose well, maybe. Well, it's difficult to revive this audience. Usually students are a little more positive in reaction, so how do I do it with this group? Raise some controversial subject, because I can go on and give a lecture on many subjects for a full hour. Yeah. Okay, so I will continue. What are the focal points in Israel today? Primarily, I'd say political and relating to our region, but also internal. You've seen the situation and the demonstrations throughout the region, in the United States, the Occupy Wall Street, the great economic problems in some countries in Europe. We are not immune to it, even though we've had a much better and more stable economy and have been less affected by the ills of some European countries. But we did have over the summer massive demonstrations of disaffected people. In one demonstration, we had 400,000 people in the streets living in tents. That is a population which is 7.5 million. Israel is not such a large country, smaller even in population than Czech Republic. The dissatisfaction was that people felt that the cost of living is such that they cannot make a living, have decent housing, have decent work, remuneration, and went to the streets and demonstrated and lived in tents in the center of the town for weeks and even months on end. The problem is that there was no political Okay, so we move to a different field, which is fine with me, two very serious questions. Let's start with Syria. Syria has been a traditional enemy of Israel, fought against Israel in 1948 when the state was founded, with the attempt to not enable it to be founded in 1967 during the war in 1973. And since then we've had kind of a ceasefire on the border between Israel and Syria for close to 40 years with very few incidents. All attempts to negotiate peace with Syria so far have failed, simply for the reason that their main demand is that they get back a piece of territory they lost in the 1967 war, a very strategic piece of territory overlooking Israel, and our feeling was that it would be too risky to do, and that in return we would not get the full peace, diplomatic ties, so that has never been resolved. Now the situation has totally changed in Syria. You all follow what's happening there. We are very concerned with what's happening there for many reasons. First, on a humanitarian, human rights basis, 9,000 Syrians have been killed over the last year, and it seems no end to it. Civilian towns and villages shelled indiscriminately. Secondly, there is the risk that Syria would disintegrate. Most Arab countries founded in the earlier part of the 20th century were based on the maps drawn by the colonial powers, mostly Britain and France, after they defeated the Ottoman Empire. And they just carved the area and gave it out according to their imperial, colonial, or post-colonial considerations, and imposed all kinds of leaders, emirs, kings, who later on were toppled, usually by colonels or generals who've been ruling until recently. And you see that the revolts are against 30 or 40-year rule of a Gaddafi, a Assad in Syria, a Salah in Yemen, and of course the Egyptians, presidents who are ex-generals who've been ruling Egypt, 3 of them in the last 60 years or so. But these borders, these artificial states have held firmly, comprising different ethnic groups in most of them, because of this iron fist of whatever leader they had, or earlier on because of the aura and authority from above of the king or the emir, believed by the citizens. Today, with all this fighting, there is a risk of disintegration. Disintegration of any of these states, and I'm not just referring to Syria. Yemen is a similar situation, Libya, and there's another risk, which we already see in the regions, not just the Middle East, but even beyond, of a new phenomenon of what's called a failed state, a state where there's no government. Take Somalia as a case in point, take Afghanistan in certain periods, where there's no governance, there's no one to refer to, there's piracy, there's no human rights, there's no international accounting, or an interim situation, which in international relations today is called a state on the way, a semi-failed state on the way to failing. So there's a risk that Syria, Yemen, Libya, countries like that would face such a situation. Now with Syria, there are additional risks. First, she has been the main supporter of Iran in the area, and the place through which all the weapons go to terrorist group, non-state actors, Hezbollah to a degree, and also Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon. Syria has very large arsenals of weapons, including weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological. And we are concerned, like everyone, that if there is disintegration, even partial, that is, if the authority of the president and the other leaders below him is eroded, such weapons could either fall into the hands of subgroups, be used against certain neighbors, all the neighbors, Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, Iraq, or fall into hands or be transferred without authority into the hands of groups like Hezbollah, like Hamas, because when a country might disintegrate, these things could happen. So we're very concerned about it, but we keep silent mainly because the tendency in our neighboring countries has been over the years, when there are hardships, when there are difficulties, rather than face internally and do stock taking, looking for an outside responsibility, which is usually Israel, the West, Britain, United States, NATO, etc. So we are keeping very silent about that. Now, Egypt, your second question, is a different story. Egypt is a much more stable, traditional country of thousands of years old, with a tradition of government, of unity, and it's the first country that signed peace with Israel in 1979, which is very important for us. The second was Jordan. With Egypt and Jordan, we have full diplomatic relations, but we've had, especially in Egypt, problem of security. We had to close the embassy because it was run down by radical groups and burnt down a few months ago. We are concerned about the possibility of Muslim fundamentalist groups, either Muslim Brotherhood or the Salafites, of taking positions critical of the peace treaty and of Israel, even though for now there's no official position to abrogate the treaty. At the best, there's some talks about renegotiating certain paragraphs, two specific ones, that is, the Sinai Desert between Israel and Egypt is demilitarized basically, so they would like to have more authority to bring more troops into there. And the second is a commercial issue. They've been selling gas to Jordan and Israel, and the claim is that the earlier government contracts were affected by corruption, and they want maybe to renegotiate the price. So these are specific issues, but we are concerned about a turn towards fundamental radicalism, which might happen in Egypt. There is another minor concern, more American than Israeli today, that certain NGOs are being placed on trial. 43 members of NGOs have been accused of meddling in the affairs of the state and influencing it, and they would be facing trial. Some of them have taken refuge in the American embassy compound. That could affect the ability of Egypt to gain loans in the international market and to continue the aid from the United States, which could affect economic stability, which again could be something negative because of the great concern of such countries losing stability, and with Egypt there's much less concern than with Yemen and Syria. But these are good questions which relate to our standing in the Middle East today and to our concerns, which are relatively new. In the past, our main concerns were negotiating a treaty or implementing a treaty with Arab neighbors or fighting terrorism. But these developments, called the Arab Spring, whatever term you'd like to call it, are of much greater concern to us, but not just to us. So let's get some more questions now that we've warmed up, please. Yes, yes. Oh, very good question. Like with Czech Republic and Czechoslovakia, we didn't have relations with China, but even earlier on, the Chinese communists refused to have relations with Israel until 1991. We didn't even have basic relations, even though we recognized them immediately in 1949. But once we established these relations, they've been flourishing to a great degree. In a way, like the Czech Republic, trying to catch up with decades of low-level relations or no relations. With China, they picked up, and also with India, at an incredible pace, economically, technologically, academically, because the Chinese value very much the Israeli and Jewish experience and tradition. So they picked up remarkably. And today we have not only an embassy in Beijing, but several consulates, and it's considered really a number one priority. To be an Israeli ambassador in China is really great as being in Prague, of course. It's not, relations are not being affected by the Chinese refusing to condemn Syria, refusing to join the Security Council countries in tightening the sanctions on Iran. The reason being that relations between Israel and China and also India are seen on more bilateral level and not affected by it. We are somewhat displeased that India, China, and Russia also do not take the stance which the EU and Western countries are taking on Iran and in Syria, but does not affect the bilateral relations in any meaningful way. Relations are flourishing and doing extremely well. Okay, let's take some more questions against your fields of interest. Please.
And I meet there some friends from Lebanese Forces Student Association, and they told me that they also have a friends from Israel, but the relationship between Israel and Lebanon there, it's a bit cooled down because of the war. And my question is, if you think that it's going to turn better for both sides.
Okay, very good question regarding Lebanon. Lebanon has really no conflict with Israel. About 12 years ago, the border has been marked and sanctioned by the United Nations, the border between Lebanon and Israel. So there are no territorial disputes, there are no other disputes, except that Lebanon belongs to the Arab camp. There are 21 Arab countries, belongs to the Arab League, and sides with the Arabs and Palestinians on any subject when it relates to Israel. But Lebanon is a weak country, and it's been controlled to a great degree in recent decades by Syria. Until recently, when the Syrians are involved with their own troubles, the Syrians practically ran Syria. The Syrian army controlled Syria and was stationed there for decades. Syria only opened an embassy in Lebanon in recent years. What does that mean? Czech Republic doesn't have an embassy in Brno, right? Because it's part of Czech Republic. And Syria didn't have an embassy in Beirut because they considered it part of their area of influence, part of their domain. Now it's different for extraneous reasons. So, and then you have another factor in Lebanon, which is novel, which is new in international relations, where you have an armed militia which does not answer to the state, the Hezbollah, stationed in the south but present in parliament and in government, with a militia which has been fighting against Israel for almost 2 decades, which the Lebanese army cannot disarm. The Lebanese army cannot come into the camps, and there's no situation today, I think maybe except Afghanistan or some sections, maybe of Pakistan, where a state cannot have a monopoly on the arms, where the state army faces a militia which is better armed, much more radical, and cannot assert the sovereignty of the state. And of course, Hezbollah is totally opposed to Israel, has shelled us, attacked us, kidnapped our soldiers several times, and it's been threatening the continued conflict and use of weapons, especially if there's any deterioration with Iran. So even though the Lebanese, the major part of them, might want peace and tranquility with Israel, we've always said it will be the second country to sign peace with us, but it does not have the ability, first because of the outside influence of Syria, but primarily because of the internal group of Hezbollah, this non-state actor, which will not allow them to make any gesture towards Israel, and if anything, might drag them into further conflict. Because if Hezbollah attacks Israel with missiles, as they threaten time and again, there will be an Israeli response, and because they live on Lebanese territory, there will be casualties, there will be damage, like we had 6 years ago during the previous clash in 2006, and then earlier on in 96. So that's the tragedy of Lebanon, that it's being held by internal and external forces which determine to a great degree its freedom of action. Okay, let's take some more questions.
Actually, I have 2 questions. First of all, what do you think about Barack Obama and his relationship, to Israel? Because I was in Israel 2 years ago in a kibbutz, and when I spoke with people, they weren't happy, if I say it very simply. And the second question is about Orthodox Jewish. What do you think about them? Because most people in Israel, they just say like they are making children and praying and that's all, and we have to support them.
Okay, 2 very delicate questions. I'll start with the second one. Usually people ask me, are Israelis religious or secular? And my answer would be it depends on your kind of question. If the question would be very broad, like the broadest question, do they believe in God? So most Israelis, 80% probably would say yes. But if you narrow it down, say, to a much narrower plane, Do you observe all the rituals dictated in the Torah and the scriptures? So you get probably 15, maybe 20% religious. And the rest in between, those who observe the Sabbath, those who observe the dietary laws, so you get certain percentages. In recent decades, religious Israeli parties have become savvy as far as going into politics and having greater influence. And that's also affected by the numbers, as you indicated in more simplistic, I'd say, terms. They have more children, the children grow up, they can vote, and they can get a greater proportion of representation in parliament. And you do have religious parties in parliament and in the coalition governments, and when they come to the table to negotiate, so they demand that the government make concessions to them, for example, in housing, because they're large families, or, for example, the crisis we might have faced this very week. Traditionally, when the state was founded, we needed to have conscription to the army, which we still face today. So every young Israeli, like those of you who are at college age, at the age of 18, men go to the army for 3 years, women for 2 years. How would you like that, by the way? Not popular here? No. Okay. But when the state was founded, so the founder of the state, David Ben-Gurion, gave exemption to a specific number of Orthodox young people because of the following argument. The religious rabbis came to him and said, for millennia, we had many Orthodox traditional schools, yeshivas, in Central Europe, very famous, where young Jews studied full-time. All these yeshivas were wiped out during the Holocaust, especially in Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, some over here. Give the opportunity to young Israelis who want to study to be exempt from military service. That was agreed, and the figure then was just a few thousand. But now, with the increase of population, you have dozens of thousands of young Israelis who don't go to the army and don't share the burden of conscription and 3 years in the army. In addition, there is another difference between secular and Orthodox. In the secular community, especially the Jewish secular community, men and women go to work more or less on an equal basis. In the Muslim Arab community, and there are about 1.5 million non-Jews who live in Israel, so women are not yet fully represented in the workforce because of tradition. The Muslim woman stays at home and doesn't mix at college or at school or in the workplace with men sitting together. Who knows what could happen. In the Orthodox community, it's exactly the opposite. The women go to work and the men study. So the feeling in the Israeli public is that secular Israelis are discriminated against in 2 ways. One is they serve in the army for 3 years and then they do reserve duty until they're in their 40s. And secondly, you have a very large group of people who are not in the workforce and draw subsidies from the state and demand social security and medical while not working and not producing. That is Orthodox men. So these are the kind of crises we have on secular religious, which might come to the early elections these coming months unless they find some kind of modus to reenact the legislation, because this exemption from military service was based on legislation which was thrown out by the court just 48 hours ago. Courts in Israel are very strong, especially the Supreme Court. People can go to the Supreme Court directly, something you probably can't do here, right? If you have a grievance, can you go straight to the Supreme Court in Brenner with it? Probably not. You need to go through all kinds of legal proceedings. Israel, any Israeli, any Palestinian even, not citizens of Israel, who feels wronged can appeal straight to the Supreme Court in its sitting as a High Court of Justice. So we had 2 days ago this kind of ruling that the court said it's illegal. And on another level, we had another case not related where a Palestinian, non-Israeli, who was under arrest for belonging to Islamic Jihad, went on a hunger strike and said he's going to strike to the death until he's released. His lawyers went to the Supreme Court and apparently, for concern that the court would rule in his favor, he was released. So hunger strike is over and he's released, which showed the power of the individual, even if he's non-Israeli. So that was the second question. The first one is more delicate, especially because the professor told me that this is being recorded or the internet site, etc. Diplomats are not supposed to comment on foreign leaders, Czech, American, or even on Israeli. So I will be very general on such a subject by saying that, which is true, Israel and the United States are very close on political, strategic matters. President Obama and Israeli leaders consult all the time. President Peres will be seeing him in the coming days. Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to Washington the first week of March for continuous consultations. And most of these consultations are about our neighborhood, discussed earlier, and about Iran. So regardless of what some Israelis might think on this kibbutz or in this town, and Israelis are very critical of their own government and foreign governments, relations are important to us. The American president, whomever he or she is, Republican or Democrat, are considered to be our closest ally, and we place a lot of value on their opinions, even if we sometimes disagree. So, let's get to the question. So far, I had it easy, except maybe for the last one. Yes, 1 second. Okay, let's start.
When you spoke about every Israeli serving for 3 years, I would be maybe interested in your experience, because you must have served in very interesting times during the 60s and the 70s. So if you can share some of your personal experiences from the army, and well, you already opened it up, consultations about Iran. So something about that, if possible.
I can't tell you too much about my personal experiences. I did at the time it was 2.5 years. It was just before the heightened conflict with the Arabs. I was in the Northern Command, nothing too exciting, but both my children served in the army, and they had totally different experiences. Our son loved the army. He was in a high-tech unit, but if you go into such specialized units, so you need to sign on for several more years because of the training you get. So he liked it very much. He was in high-tech, and he continued to study mathematics, and now he's involved in high-tech. What he didn't like was the difficulties that when he was caught by military police with his shoes not polished or without his hat on his head, and he was fined and even threatened with prison, that he didn't like at all. So he didn't stay on. But he still does reserve duty every year for 2 or 3 weeks, and he likes it very much to interact with younger people in the same unit. Our daughter had a different experience. She served for 20 months at the time, and now it's 2 years. She went into military intelligence, liaison with foreign countries, but she didn't like it too much. She liked the basic training very much, because in the basic training you meet people from all walks of life, but not people you associate with normally. Say you're students at university, you meet more or less people with similar background, but she would tell us how she would observe the young corporal who was just 19 years old trying to break a group of 18 years old so that they would obey every order as though it was given from above by a king, and how they resisted and how difficult it was to see people from Russian, Ethiopian, Moroccan backgrounds reacting to authority and not really realizing the purpose of why they were told to run around the camp at 2 in the morning for 20 minutes with some on their back. So these were the experiences. They were not so much combat experiences, but these kind of experiences show the importance for young Israelis. First, they get a profession in the army, in many cases. Secondly, they get life experience, listening to authority, which you need in any workplace or in any situation, working with other people of different background, responsibility. So these are the positive advantages you get from the military service. Yes. And Iran, I'll get to Iran in a minute. But I don't
if I can have a personal question. Your embassy is 24 hours a day guarded. Do you think sometimes about the possibility of some terrorist attack? Because I think it have to be very stressful sometimes.
Well, you know that last week we had 3 attempted and real attacks in different capitals. In New Delhi, a wife of one of our diplomats is injured and is still in hospital from a bomb placed in the car. In Tbilisi, in Georgia, someone placed a bomb under the car of a worker of the embassy, but fortunately it fell off during the ride and nothing happened. And in Bangkok, 3 Iranian terrorists prepared some major operations. Something went wrong, and the bomb exploded in the apartment where they were preparing it. So one of them ran out, tried to grab a taxi wouldn't stop, so he threw a grenade into the taxi, and then he injured himself and was captured, and now the Thai authorities are investigating. So of course there is such risk, and you live with it. I don't feel stressful, but it's because it's a way of life. You don't believe it, but you get used to it. I got used to it. My 4 years in Geneva, when I was, for example, a professor spoke about an article I wrote. I was interviewed once in the Tribune de Genève, and there was a picture on the front page with some of the text, and someone sent it back to the embassy with a note, "He will be killed next week." So they filed it, and nothing happened, as you see. But we live under such risks, and many of our diplomats have been kidnapped, have been injured, and even have been killed. Both ambassadors and also junior diplomats. It's part of professional life. But I hope I don't seem too stressed by it. Iran, it ties into the earlier discussion, really, because of the angle of terrorism. Iran is of great concern, not just to us, but to the international community. Here's a radical, fundamentalist country led by a supreme leader who is religious authority. There's also a president and a parliament, embarked upon a program of developing a nuclear weapon, which publicly they're denying, preparing long-range missiles which could take these devices to distances not just Israel, but also to Europe and beyond and space, and declaring openly that a country like Israel, which is small, can be wiped out by 1 or 2 bombs, while they can take the punishment and any kind of retaliation and survive. And also at the same time saying that Holocaust never happened, it's a legend, and even if it happened in Europe, it's not our business, while we're preparing the second one, ready to destroy as well. So the international community has been on the case of Iran for years. There have been, I think, 6 Security Council resolutions. The International Atomic Energy Agency has been to Iran many times. The feeling is that the Iranians are not telling the truth, that they do have a military nuclear program, that they're going to develop a bomb, that they're going to come out with it only when it's too late. And there are now strong sanctions in place, not strong enough in our view. The sanctions should be stronger in the area of energy and in the area of financial sanctions. What will be the outcome of it? It's difficult to tell now because the Iranians are standing firm on their right to produce nuclear energy and in our view for military purposes. Their neighbors are very concerned. The Arab countries bordering on Iran, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf countries, because they would be the first one to suffer and the first one to be dominated by a nuclear Iran. So we would hope that the sanctions would hold and be effective and take place, but there has to be a military option, that the Iranians would be afraid that if they continue to face the world, and if the sanctions don't work, that there might be some kind of military strike by some party or several parties to prevent this nuclear scenario from happening. So that, I think, more or less sums the Iranian case, in our view, of course. Other questions? We still have a few minutes.
Mr. Ambassador, a little bit different question, if I may. In a couple of recent years, Israel discovered 2 huge gas fields in its shallow waters, and now it's in the process of searching for the ways how to exploit them effectively. I would like to know what kind of influence, according to your judgment, these discoveries can have upon the Israeli strategic behavior, strategic reasoning. Thank you.
Gas.
Yeah.
Historically, Israel has no natural resources, no oil, no uranium, some minerals in the Dead Sea. But recently, there have been 2 discoveries, as you said, of gas fields in the Mediterranean and the potential of a few others. There are some political difficulties here. One is 2 of those fields are between us and Cyprus, and we have some plan to utilize them together, which is not viewed so favorably by Turkey, especially because of their differences with Cyprus, but also with us, but mainly in this case with Cyprus. Because, as you know, Cyprus is divided between the Greek part and the non-recognized Turkish Republic there. The second difficulty might be with Lebanon, because one of the potential fields not yet discovered, in the Lebanese view, could be partially theirs. But they're not willing to talk to us about it, of course, because they have no relations with Lebanon. They're not willing to sit down to the table and maybe divide the area or delineate it. So these are two problems. But the main concern is, as I think you indicated in the question, what to do about it, how to utilize it. And there is a committee in Israel, an intergovernmental committee, considering several scenarios. For example, the time range. Is it better to produce the gas in a short time span of, say, 10, 15 years and export most of it? Because, let's say, in 20, 30 years, maybe gas will be no more popular. Maybe there will be alternate energies and there will be no market for gas or lower market. Or is it better to plan for long term and do it over 30, 40 years and export part of it and use the rest for its ready consumption? That is an economic consideration and also a consideration of futurology, of how do you see substitutes for energy, which is something well developed in Israel. Energy substitutes, especially the area of electric cars, which is partially an Israeli innovation called Better Place, trying to create a grid of electric outlets for cars throughout the country, small country, smaller than the Czech Republic, in order to avoid the dependence on fossil fuel. And then there's the question of how to transport the gas, whether to transport it to Israel, whether to build a pipe all the way to Eilat, and then you can export it to places like China, Japan, India, who are in need of large quantities of gas. So these are technological considerations, and then, of course, how to secure these gas fields from terrorists and from hostile elements. The gas pipe, which I mentioned earlier, which transports gas from Egypt to Israel and Jordan, has been attacked many times in the recent years since the turmoil in Egypt by would-be terrorist groups. Usually there is a disruption of a week or two until it's fixed, but then there's another attack, a part is blown up. So at sea it's a little different, but still there are risks as far as protecting it. So I don't know if I addressed the several elements of your question. Okay, good. Maybe a few more before we wind up. Please. You need a mic? Okay, and then over.
Your Excellency, let me join the historian and the present time. You mentioned the relations between former Czechoslovakia and new, in that time, new state Israel in 1949, according to military help in 1948. In that time, the Czechoslovakia was almost the only European country who supported Israel. It's a little bit strange. For example, in that time, Great Britain was on the opposite side than Israel. They sent the positions to Arabs, and because of that, Israeli lost many lives during the war. Don't you think that the situation now is getting a little bit similar? I don't speak about Great Britain. I speak about the official EU policy toward to Israel and the position of Czech Republic. I think that in past months or years, we saw the situation that the position of Czech Republic was isolated, supporting the Israel, and the position of European Commission and EU was different. So I know that it's a little bit a delicate question, but you mentioned the time after the Second World War, and I think that the situation in that time and now are really, from my point of view, quite similar.
Yeah, thank you. Historically speaking, there is a very simple reason why Great Britain opposed Israel at the time, because Great Britain had the mandate over Palestine. It divided Palestine to Transjordan, gave it to Jordan in 1922, kept West Bank and Israel until they could no more rule the area because of strong opposition, mainly from the Jewish population, to the British rule, because they prevented survivors from the Holocaust from immigrating, and they stayed for 3 years in camps, displaced people's camps in Europe. So Great Britain really opposed Israel and armed some of the Arab countries, trained the Jordanian Legion, which was the best fighting force against Israel, and a British colonel also commanded the Jordanian Arab Legion until 1956. So that's the historic reason. The historical reasons why not only Czechoslovakia but also Soviet Union supported Israel's independence, recognized it immediately, was related to it, because they figured that the founding fathers of Israel, who came with the political culture of the Ukraine, of Russia, of Czechoslovakia, of Poland, of Belarus, would form a socialist state leaning to the east during the Cold War. We're talking about 48, 49. That's why they supported us and even spoke for us in the United Nations when Israel was about to be established and later gained independence. But after a while, they realized this wasn't the case, especially after the Korean War, where Israel wouldn't side with the Soviet bloc, and in fact was more pro-American. And then they gradually cut the ties, diminished them. They had also the paranoia of the trials in the early 50s, beginning in Moscow against the so-called Jewish doctors, which were poisoning Stalin, and then the orders to Czechoslovakia, to Hungary, to hold the show trials over here, where most of those accused, tortured, condemned and executed were Jewish. Here it was 11 out of the 14 convicted in the Slansky trial were Jewish, including Secretary General of the Communist Party. So that's the historical angle. Today it's a totally different story. Today, indeed, you see several countries supporting Israel in the EU deliberations, of course, Czech Republic, Holland, but also several others, just to mention Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and Germany, sometimes Britain, France, and those opposed to us for a variety of reasons. The variety of reasons would be a large Muslim population, for example, in certain Western European countries, affinity to the Arabs, a view of Palestinians as underdogs, or specific disagreements with particular Israeli policies. In our view, often the discussions in Brussels, rather than focusing on really difficult and major issues of international relations, focus on minuscule aspects of Israeli-Palestinian relations, and we pointed out often to our European counterparts. But it's correct that we have less support today in Western Europe than we had in the past. That is correct, and we try to remedy it to the best of our ability. There was a question over here. Please.
I have one important question. 2 days ago, the Israeli authorities made a deal with Kader Adnan's lawyers that if he ends his hunger strike that lasts 66 days, his administrative detentions will not be renewed. What do you think about this case? Because he was in charge. There was no trial. Some people think that the international law was broken.
Yes, I think I referred to it when giving an example of the independence of the Israeli judicial system. We've had a case of this gentleman you mentioned. I'll repeat it again. He was detained because of suspicions of belonging to a radical group, Islamic Jihad, which practices terrorism against Israel, mostly from Gaza, tries to do it from the West Bank, has been responsible, the organization, for the recent shellings of rockets against Israel from Gaza. He was detained, and he went on a hunger strike, and it came to the Supreme Court, and because the authorities in Israel estimated that the Supreme Court would rule that he has to be released, he was released and he ended his hunger strike, which shows the ability even of a Palestinian belonging to a radical group in the West Bank being victorious against the Israeli establishment through the legal system. Why was he detained in administrative detention? When you fight terrorism, you can't always bring to the court the information and the proof you have, because it comes from sources which will be burnt and will not be operative or effective the next time. So it's a delicate balance whether you want to go to trial and expose those sources or whether you prefer not to, and there is this tool of administrative detention in fighting terrorism. So that is the case, but it's resolved in any case, and he's been released. There was a question over here. Yes.
there were several attempts. I mean, the process ended in 2005, I think, with Syria to end the hostilities, and it stopped before before one elections, before next round of the election in Israel. Why you didn't start this negotiation again with Syria? And second question, if something happened with the United States, I mean some economic collapse or something else, could Israel stand by themselves in region, or do you need help by United States? I mean, complete withdrawal from region. I mean, now no more bases in.
Okay, it's the second one is easier. It's not. We don't get economic help from the United States. We get some form of military assistance in the form of assistance to buy the planes we need for self-defense and other military equipment. I don't see the United States collapsing economically. If it would affect the world economy. The Israeli economy is, of course, dependent on export primarily to the EU, but also to the United States and to China and to India. So, of course, it would be like every economy affected. And we also have very strong ties in the high-tech area of Israelis and Americans working together. But not so much economic assistance. We used to get it in the past. That's been phased out many years ago. Regarding Syria, that's a good question maybe to wrap up on, because it's a question of principle. When an Israeli government is replaced by a new government, there are new policy lines. It's normal. It's like in the Czech Republic. But of course here it's not so much regarding peace with neighbors, which you have, but it's, say, economic policy or social policy, pensions, how much to pay for doctor's visits, etc. When a new government comes in, especially if it's a different one, it's elected on a different platform. And it's the normal thing to say, with all due respect, let's say former Prime Minister Olmert, you negotiated with Syria, well, in the case it was with Mr. Barak long ago, or Mr. Olmert, you negotiated with the Palestinians on your platform. There was no agreement. We are not obligated by the positions you presented to the Syrians or to the Palestinians. We are elected on a different platform. We're willing to start the negotiation. And then there's a second question, why didn't an agreement with Syria work out? I think it was about 10, 11 years ago. Many books have been written about it. Why were we close to an agreement, but why didn't it work out? And there's no objective judge who would tell you why. Some would say because the Syrians weren't willing to give us real, meaningful, full peace in return. Others would say because Israel was reluctant to give them 100% of that piece of territory. They want the Golan Heights. And in hindsight, others would say, weren't we smart not to make an agreement 11 years ago? Because look at Syria today. Will whomever succeeds Assad honor this agreement, or say, like some say in Egypt, well, this dictator who signed the peace and made concessions to Israel, that doesn't obligate us. Let's start again and let's abrogate the treaty. So all these are theoretical questions, but they point out to the general tone of discussion we had now regarding Israel and Arab neighbors, and maybe I'll try and wrap it up on that. We talked a little about diplomatic work and about economy and social affairs, but a lot of the questions and your interest was Israel and her neighbors, prospects for peace, what's happening in the Arab world, and Iran. And the main theme there is the complexity of the situation and how fluid it is. Israel is one actor, and we have many states in the area, and we have Arab states and Iran, and now we have new non-state actors and terrorist groups who have completely different characteristics. So when one actor like Israel needs to sit at an imaginary table with 15, 20 other elements, states, non-states, governments which are there today but could collapse tomorrow, a colonel or general who rules the country but a few months later is put on trial or escapes and asks for asylum elsewhere. It's a very complex situation, and leadership needs to calculate very carefully and calibrate what risks you can take and what risks are too great to take because of this changing situation and because of your dependence also on many other factors like an economic, like external factors. A country like Iran, it's not an Arab country, it doesn't border on Israel, but it has ambitions in the area against Arab countries and against us. So it's not easy to make these kinds of decisions in a democracy where 2 minutes after you sit in a closed room and make a decision, if there are more than one person. It's out on the intranet, and it's public discussion and domain. It's very difficult to make these decisions, also when you depend on a coalition which has many parties with interests which are not necessarily primary on war and peace, but they're more like the question we got there, on religious and secular, and how do you compensate them in fields which have nothing to do regarding peace and war, but you need to preserve your coalition in order to have the political support for any stand you take. So hopefully this gives any listener some appreciation of the complex difficulties for any Israeli politician and decision maker. And if we make errors and we make mistakes, it's perhaps because of the uncertain circumstances we're operating within and the changing circumstances in our region, where within a year several of the leaders are no more there, and there's such uncertainty who will lead them in the future. When there's uncertainty regarding Iran, is she indeed close to producing a nuclear weapon? What are her intentions? What will the great powers do? Why are some of them refusing to join others in the Security Council in condemning Iran or Syria, etc.? So I thank you for your questions. I thank you for listening carefully and for your participation and for the invitation to speak.
Thank you very much. Our time is up, unfortunately. I would like to thank you very much to His Excellency Yaakov Levy for being here with us, sharing his views on the current situation in Israel. I'd like to thank the Embassy of the State of Israel for cooperating on the organization of this event. I'd like to thank you, to thank all of you for participating. I hope you like the format of our public lectures. And indeed, I would like to extend my invitation to another public lecture in this series. In 2 weeks exactly, we are hosting here a professor of philosophy and economics from University of Arizona, Professor David Schmitz. So please register, come in 2 weeks if you want to get updates on our events, books, and news about what's happening at school. Please sign up for it on our website. Indeed, as you can see, we have our first ball, so you can dance with us as well in Český Krumlov in a couple of days. In any case, thank you for being here. I'd like to see you all at some of the events in the future, and wish you luck and have a nice afternoon. Thank you.